feel like making pancakes this morning. Let me find a good recipe for pancakes. Oh, that one takes buttermilk. Well, buttermilk, and then it also asks for confectioners or powdered sugar on top. Oh, I really don't want to go to the store. Or do I have to go to the store? Well, hello everyone. I'm Laura Petty, County Extension Agent for Family and Community Health in Leon County. And today we're going to be talking about some kitchen tips or shortcuts that'll kind of help you maybe in those emergency situations when you find out you don't have the ingredient you really need. So it's not a perfect fit for all experiences, but it's maybe some tips that can help you in a situation like that. So we're going to start off by talking about making your own buttermilk. A lot of us like to make buttermilk biscuits or buttermilk pancakes, but we hate to keep that buttermilk in the refrigerator all the time. And it's just another ingredient we have to worry about keeping up with and refrigerating. And so today we're going to talk about a quick way to make buttermilk that is a good ingredient for some of your recipes. So basically what you take is, you have your milk here, just plain old milk, and vinegar or lemon juice. Either one will work. And what you need is a tablespoon of whichever you're using. So we're going to be using vinegar today, just a white distilled vinegar. Put that in your measuring cup. Pour your milk then to the 1 cup line. Give it a little stir. Let it sit for about 5 minutes and you'll have buttermilk, 1 cup of buttermilk for your next recipe, needing it for, we do it a lot for pancakes. You just make it real quick while you're mixing up your flour and other ingredients, and then your buttermilk is ready to add to your ingredients to make your favorite recipe. Okay, next we're going to talk about, sometimes a recipe is calling for a certain kind of sugar, and we tend to have white sugar on hand pretty regularly, but then something might call for a brown sugar. And let's say we have maybe light brown sugar on hand, but we don't have the darker brown sugar on hand. So today we're going to take regular old table sugar, white sugar, and turn it into brown sugar for a recipe that we're using. Okay, so I've taken a cup of white sugar, and what we can add to it is molasses. And molasses is actually a byproduct when sugar is made. So this is being added back to the white sugar to give it that brown flavoring or brown coloring, and it's going to make it now brown sugar. So let's say that our recipe needs us to make a brown sugar that is lighter. So we're just going to be adding 1 tablespoon of molasses. You can also perhaps use things like agave nectar or maybe some honey, but you won't get the same effect that you will with this molasses because of it being a byproduct of as sugar is made. So then you would just take a fork and kind of stir it around, and it looks like a big mess right now, but you'll have to work it, and you'll see that it starts to become kind of that grainy texture that brown sugar has. You can see it kind of grabbing that color, and again, if you want to go with a darker color, then you can certainly put more molasses in and it will give it that color. So it's just a matter of working all that molasses in. It's going to take a few minutes to get that done, but it's the time you would save than running to the store to get brown sugar. Well, I wanted to show you all the result of a little more hard work. We took our granulated or white sugar and put a tablespoon of molasses in it to turn it into a light brown sugar. So after we worked a little harder at it and got it mixed up, it definitely looks just like the brown sugar you would purchase in the package. Again, if you want to make it a dark sugar, then brown sugar, then you can certainly add 1 more tablespoon of the molasses to it, stir it up some more, and it'll be that darker color that you're looking for. So anyway, I just want to show you the final product of that. Speaking of sugars, there's been times when I have run out of confectioners or powdered sugar when I'm in the middle of baking some sort of birthday cake or something that I'm taking to a bake sale, whatever it might be. And instead of running to the store, I'm always thinking, now what else can I do? What different recipe can I use? But just nothing beats the fluffy buttercream frosting that you add to a cake or other desserts. So one time I was looking at this, trying to figure out what to do, and I came across a quick little shortcut that would help alleviate the problem. Again, using just granulated sugar, it's about 1 cup to, this is not quite a cup, but the equivalent would be 1 cup to 1 tablespoon of cornstarch. And you will be amazed about how pretty and fluffy this powdered sugar turns out. So we've got just a little bit of, I just wanted to show for a little bit. So we're gonna probably put, this is probably about a 1/2 cup of sugar. So I'm gonna put about a 1/2 tablespoon of cornstarch in here. And you can use a blender, food processor, coffee grinder, whatever type of appliance you have to get this ground up to the consistency that you want. So I'm gonna make a little noise for a moment. I like to run it for just a few moments and give it a check. You can tell that powder's really coming out of there already. It's still a little granulated, so we're gonna run it a little bit more. Definitely in the messy category, but again, you will get the best homemade powdered sugar from this product. And again, it may not be so far, may not be quite to our texture that we want, but again, you can just kind of combine it a little bit more. But you can tell that that powder that's coming off is already a confectioner's or powdered sugar, and that's what we're looking for. So you just keep processing it, pulsing it, or in your blender, whatever it might be, a little bit longer until it becomes more of that powdery consistency and texture that you're looking for that buttercream frosting that you're wanting to make. So I hope that is a good shortcut for you when you're running out of certain ingredients, but you want that fluffy buttercream icing for a recipe. You can use a food processor, blender, coffee grinder, whatever it might be, to get your white sugar down into a powdered sugar with just a little bit of cornstarch. So there's a variety of flours on the market now, and a lot of people have sensitivities to gluten, so wheat products are a concern. And so people are looking at alternative flour sources, and so one that I thought was very interesting is oatmeal or oat flour. You come across recipes that call for oat flour, and again you think, oh, I've got to run to the store, make a special trip to buy that product in the store. So here's a way to make oat flour very, very quickly without having to make that trip to the store. A lot of us keep oatmeal on hand for making oatmeal or for making cookies or whatever it might be. So simply taking about a cup of oatmeal, or depending on how much flour you're going to need, putting it again in your food processor, blender, something like that, and turning it into flour basically to use for a recipe. So again, I'm gonna make some more noise here. We're gonna turn it on and let it grind up. We're going to take a look at it here in a moment. One thing I wanted to point out as we were working on the powdered sugar is that you probably want to wait before you take the lid off. It was so powdery and dusty. You might want to take a few minutes before you take that lid off just to let that dust kind of settle down. So let's take a look at our flour here. We have a pretty good texture of flour. You can still see there's some oat down there that needs to be ground up, and this is what they consider old-fashioned oats. So it's a little bit bigger of the grain, and that's what I prefer to have at our home. But you can tell that this makes a very nice flour here. And again, you probably for a recipe, you'd want it ground a little bit more. So again, just put your stuff back together, process it a little bit more to get more of a finer flour. So again, just maybe try something different in your recipes. Trying an oat flour, because oatmeal is a very healthy grain for us. It's a whole grain that we need to incorporate into our diets. So make sure that we are incorporating something like oat flour if we're using a different recipe, or a recipe that calls for a different type of flour, or if we're trying to replace some of our flours. And we can certainly provide you some more information about what the equivalent is between all-purpose flour and these other flours. Okay, moving on to some other flour products that sometimes trouble us. When you come across a recipe and it calls for cake flour. Again, most of us keep all-purpose flour on hand most of the time, but we don't tend to keep a lot of those other ones. Nowadays we have whole wheat flour, we have oat flours, we have semolina flour, we have all types of flours, cake flours, bread flours, and it's really hard to keep all of those in stock at your home at all times. So here's a few tips on how to turn our all-purpose flour into cake flour and bread flour. If your recipes are calling for those particular flours, you can create that using all-purpose flour. I'm not going to make any today, I'm just going to kind of give you the tips on how to make those products, but you're going to start with your all-purpose flour for both of them. For the cake flour, you're going to use, for 1 cup of cake flour, you're going to use 1 cup minus 2 tablespoons of all-purpose flour, and to that you will add the 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, which would then bring you up to your 1 cup. And you want to stir that together, and that will provide you cake flour for the recipes that are asking for that. On the other side, we have self-rising flour. So that's another one that maybe you'll come across a recipe that will call for self-rising flour. And so we need to keep in mind that, well, if we don't keep that on hand, how can then we use our all-purpose flour to make that type of flour? So it takes a few more ingredients, but we're going to do, for a cup of self-rising flour, we're going to use 1 cup of our all-purpose flour. We're going to use 1½ teaspoons of baking powder, and then 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And that is what you use to make self-rising flour. So again, there are some other options of other types of flours that you can make using the base of all-purpose flour, but these are 2 that we tend to see a lot in recipes, so they're good to have on hand. In some future videos, I'm going to do some about making our own baking mix, things that we can use at home that don't have a lot of preservatives, and something that we have on hand at all times, something we can stick in the freezer, pull out when we need it, and use it as we need to. Okay, for our last few tips, we're going to talk about replacing when we don't have baking powder on hand, and then we're going to finish up with a little demonstration about butter. So if you don't have baking powder on hand, you can substitute about 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda with about 5/8 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, and that will replace your baking powder in a recipe. So there is no substitute for using baking soda, but we can replace our powder with using these 2 products here. So we're going to finish up with talking about butter. So let's say we're making our pie crust and it calls for that butter to be kind of grated up or kind of cut up in fine pieces for us to make that pie crust. Or let's say you have a recipe that asks for the butter to be softened. So a quick way of helping that, because I never remember to get the butter out until I'm in the middle of the recipe and it tells me it needs to be softened or grated or cut up or whatever it might be. So what I found was that if you take your butter and you then use a grater to grate it down, so then this can be added to your flour mixture when you're making a pie crust. It will be much easier to cut that into your flour mixture. And then on the other hand, if you are having a recipe that calls for your butter to be softened, then there's more surface area on these grated pieces, so your butter would melt a lot faster in your product, and it'd be easier to mix it up into your product versus having to wait until it's softened or put it in the microwave and it half melts. I mean, I run into all those problems. So just by grating your butter, you're getting it to where it has more surface area and can soften faster, or it can be an easier product to integrate into a flour mixture to make a pastry. Well, I hope you've enjoyed these tidbits and tips that I've shared today. Again, they're just things that if you're in an emergency situation or you're in a situation where you are not ready to add an ingredient, then there's some substitutes or tips that you can do that can help you either save money from buying all these extra products or just be able to use what you have on hand. So I hope you enjoy, and we'll be back with some more features in the future, maybe some recipe demonstrations and talking about my plate and nutritious foods and physical activities. So we look forward to seeing you in the future. And if you ever have questions, please feel free to contact our office at 903-536-2531. Thank you.